I was asked to relate a little about my acquaintance with Geshe Wangyal. I first met him around Christmas time in 1962. The meeting was arranged by my good friend, Tom Griffin. I had been meditating first on the sky during a trip to Tahiti on a freighter out of New York. During my stay away from college, from Harvard, after my freshman year, I'd gone to Vermont, and after a few months in the fall of 1959, when the weather got cold, I moved to a house in the woods in Rhode Island. And then in January of 1960, took a freighter out of New York. The trip took 45 days. And on the 10-day trip out of the Panama Canal to Papeete, Tahiti, the Pacific Ocean was extremely Pacific, very calm. And I lay on a very small deck around the smokestack on the windward side, so I didn't get any smoke. Lay on my back, staring at the sky, doing sky meditation. And anyway, I continued that off and on. Right through many events which I won't recount. And then in my senior year at Harvard, I'd covered over my big bay window, and I had turned my room into a dark retreat and was staring into complete darkness. I didn't know it, but I was making something quite like a dark retreat house, as is done in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And Tom had become a little concerned about my mental health. And he had heard about Geshe Wangyal in Freewood Acres, New Jersey. And he suggested we go down and meet him. During Christmas vacation. I was not too deeply impressed with Geshe in that first meeting. But for some reason, and I cannot tell you what the reason was, I came back to visit him on my own. And during that visit, began to be inspired by his teaching of a appropriate meditation. In this case, it was the 7 quintessential instructions for generating love, compassion, and the altruistic intention to become enlightened. And this has been a key feature for my mind ever since then. So this was in the spring of 1963. Must have been February or March. I can't say why I went back, but I can say why I became fascinated. Geshe Wangyal said something to the effect that, well, you can't do this seriously. He was giving me a hard time. But as you're going to work on the subway in Boston, you can do this practice. And I thought, well, I have absolutely no intention of getting a job in Boston. My intention was to go to the woods, return to the woods in Vermont, and resume the life that I had in the cabin overlooking Shadow Lake in northern Vermont. I didn't know as I was going to end up back at Shadow Lake. But that was my intention. But I became deeply fascinated with this meditation in which I would take to mind neutral people, examples of neutral people, and then friends, and then minor enemies, and try to think that just as I want happiness and don't want suffering, so this person wants happiness and doesn't want suffering. And I became fascinated with my inability to take these people to mind without my becoming overwhelmed by my desire for my friends and my hatred toward even minor enemies, my mind becoming disturbed one way or another. And since, despite my being a major in English literature, I had taken a number of courses in psychology, and I felt I should have enough control over my own mind. But actually taking a person to mind visually would trigger my emotions, and I would be drawn into them. So I kept practicing and practicing, and I was drawn more and more into this practice. And that led me into wanting to finish my courses, and it being my senior year, to finish my courses quickly. I had only one exam. The rest of the courses were handled by writing papers. So I finished the papers, in a sense, put the one exam, which was in geology, on the shelf, and took off for the monastery. Geshe happened not to be at the monastery. He was in Washington at his work for what must have been the CIA. And so the monks lamas, geshes at the monastery let me come into the monastery and stay there until Geshe came back. So that was all very interesting. And Geshe, I don't know, after a week or 10 days, showed up, and that began the whirlwind of activity with him. And he allowed me to stay, and I began being the teacher, an English teacher, one among many, of the young Trubegu, the Trugu, who were living there. There were three. Tartse Kunga was Sakya and is still living in California. And Sherpa Rinpoche, Kamlung Rinpoche and Sherpa Rinpoche. Kamlung Rinpoche is a student of Geshe Soba. Well, we have to say it was, because Geshe Soba has passed away a couple of years ago. And Sherpa Rinpoche, who was put under the care of Geshe Soba. And there were students of Geshe Wangyal, like George Zornas, who came from New York City to teach them. And Bob Thurman and Chris George were living in the house of a neighboring Kalmuk down the street in the next block, who, because I'd been allowed to stay in the monastery house, in the monastery, were then allowed to stay in the monastery house. In a sense, Geshe Wangyal was full of energy, and in a sense, one could say that on the one hand, his teaching method was chaotic. And in another sense, he began teaching us night and day. He had Giant Sheba's Trumta Chemo, Giant Sheba's huge text on tenets, on his, what for most people would be their nightstand, but was his teaching stand down in front of him. And he sometimes would be teaching us from that. This would be Bob, Chris, and myself. And we'd be sitting on a very thin carpet, big carpet that was thin, but was throughout the room, his Geshe-la's bedroom. And we'd be sitting on that for hours upon hours throughout the day. So there was nothing chaotic about that. I suppose the only chaos was in us with our butts paining from sitting too long throughout the day. So we'll have to look at the evidence. I was born in 1940, so here it is, 2018. I'm 77 years old, and I have translated and published all of Giant Sheba's root text of that huge book on tenets, along with the commentary on the root text by the Khalkha Mongolian Nobel, and along with a good bit of Giant Sheba's own commentary from his great exposition of tenets. So obviously I was inspired by that teaching. And at the end of my 5-year stay, Chris George was there for about 5 months. Bob Thurman was there for about 1.5 years. Elvin Jones, who had bought a house down the street, moved in also. He was there for, I think, about 3 years. And when Geshe Wangyal went to teach at the University of Wisconsin, Elvin Jones moved along with Geshe Wangyal and Sherpa Drugul and Kamlung Drugul and Sherpa Drugul to Wisconsin. And so, in fact, I was the only one from that crew, from those who were living in the monastery, left. By that time, well, within the first 6 months of Chris George's being there, we built an addition onto the basic ranch house, which was the monastery, built a temple and a complex of rooms and a kitchen and dining room behind it. Behind and next and in front of the original ranch house. And actually dug out the original ranch house, so it was perched, in a sense, up on the foundation. We exposed the foundation. The hard work that we put into that, much as a lesson in impermanence, was the temple was turned into with the whole complex was purchased by a Russian church next door. So the temple was turned into a museum, cultural museum by the Russians. And the walls of the individual rooms behind it were knocked down and turned into a large meeting hall. I was called back to give a talk in our temple. A talk on the Mongolian and Tibetan Buddhism, Inner Asian Buddhism. standing on the floor that we so carefully laid, and underneath the shingles of the roof that I had so carefully laid. Carefully, yes, I guess laid. So, what I wish to say is that I was inspired to engage in that meditation. And as Geshe said one evening, that a student of his should do this all evening. Well, I'd done it a great deal while I was at Harvard. I continued to do it a great deal when I moved into the monastery. It had tremendous effect on me psychologically. So that evening I stayed up all night in what was then the temple, which was the living room of the ranch house, and continued it all night. What that meditation did for me was that it opened up and imbued into my relationships as I went backwards through my classrooms in my prep school at Pomfret, and back through my junior high school and grade school, back, going through my relationships with my classmates. It introduced a sense of commonality with all of my, with a huge number of the people that I remembered, a sense of just as I want happiness and don't want suffering. So these individual persons on whom I meditated individually and eventually opened up my non-conceptual memories way back, just suddenly dawned on me as I was a baby crawling around in my living room. And I could stay with these non-conceptual memories, crawling under chairs, and even crawling under the divan, the couch, what we called it, when I eventually learned the words, divan, and the concern of the others in the living room, and going up, climbing up on the divan and onto the table next to the divan, and pulling the chain on the lamp, and you see, it opened up all of these memories, but the non-conceptual memories, and was able to live within them, and then remembering the Tibetan language within those memories, and staring and remembering Dope Daksam, only imputed by conceptuality, and reflections that I had, which are then conceptual reflections, but memories in those states. And my first steps, walking, I was in the nested tables, which were very delicate, and I, was very aware of my mother's sense of their delicacy, and coming out between them and then standing up and walking to my father's shoe. His legs were crossed, in which he was sitting in what I came later to understand was his favorite chair, and walking to his shoe, walking to his foot. and able to remember, and then gaining all sorts of memories, and remembering lying on my stomach in my crib and coming to looking at my hand and understanding that this is, not knowing what this was, and then understanding that it's my hand. And of course not thinking this is my hand, of course, but understanding non-conceptually that this is my hand. And remembering that I didn't want to be remembered, didn't want to be recognized as a reincarnation. And then being bored lying there on my back, and then wanting to be recognized, and then doing certain things. I would move my leg 6 times, but no one noticed that it was deliberately done 6 times. I would do things 6 times. I don't know why I chose 6, and so forth. And then having memories of my former life, and thinking, oh, I should deliberately remember these, and thinking, oh, I'd never forget these, never. But then, be lying there, and then suddenly remembering this and that from a former lifetime, and, sort of like coming to. So you see, being inspired by his teaching me a certain meditation that was very helpful. And then having very bad dreams of being choked. I lived downstairs in the original, ranch house, in which was pretty much, I always had the worst room. Pretty much a hall that was on the way to the storeroom downstairs. Anyway, having bad dreams, and Geshe would come running downstairs, and he taught me that I had to understand that I was the target of my own bad karma, and take it, accept it. You see, I was screaming because I was trying to avoid it. And he taught me I had to take it and die in the dream. So this is very helpful, to take it and die. And then and you see there's a monster that used to grab me like this. And then when we played chess, I didn't tell him this, but he would grab my hands like this, and when we played chess, and he would laugh and laugh and laugh. And then I learned to just take it when the monster would grab my hands like this. There are many things like that. And then after everyone had left, and I was meditating a lot, and there are lots of things I could relate. And I would be puking in my dreams. And there was this dark stuff that was coming out of me, and then it was a fluid, but very thick, and I would do this night after night after night, and it began being lighter and lighter, and then there were these worm-like things that there was a monster, and the monster outside outside a window. Not like the monastery window, but like a window in my home in Rhode Island. and the monster would eat these. And I learned also to brush the tooth of the monster so that, I wasn't so afraid of it. To make friends with the monster. So there were a lot of this chaos and his Geshe Wangyal's flashing into anger and my having to accept his anger, having to be patient with it, that took me through a lot of my monster dreams and so forth, that took me through many, many episodes in my, shall I say, in my practice. And then one more story. I was lying on the, I guess you'd call it the stoop of the front door of the monastery. I was lying on my back, taking a rest, taking rest. And Geshe was coming up the front steps. I didn't realize it. And he said, lie down, lie the other way. And what that meant was, I was very flexible. Lie, I don't know how I understood it, but I understood it as lie cross-legged and bent over, and cross-legged and bent over, and go to sleep with my head down on my hands, to take a rest that way in my room. So I did that, next day, something like that. So I did that probably for a few days, or I don't know if it's the next day. And in my dreams, this tremendous sound of a forest, of huge number of forest fires. I didn't see the forest fires, but the sound of a huge number of forest fires occurred in the dream, you see, because he told me to do that. And years later, I read in a Tibetan text that this was one sign of the elements collapsing. So often the instructions that I got were not because I went into his room and described what was going on. And then later, I went through some tremendous experiences, far more profound. And for some reason, I can't explain why, I see everyone was gone. All of my compatriots. I was the only one living there. Left. They had left. I was there for years, meditating. And, well, first I'll say, I used to take Geshe his coffee in the morning. I would make it downstairs in the new kitchen downstairs. And I took it to him in this big bowl good-sized bowl. It was worth two and a half coffees. And I took it to him with tremendous devotion. And, carrying it to him and with tremendous prayers. And, it was all made up prayers by myself. And, much as my meditations were made up by myself. And took it to him and set it down in front of him. And he laughed and laughed and laughed. Pretty much to say, stop this. Like, stop this. Very interesting. I've often thought that your devotion to me is like there's someone else. You see, there's someone else. There's the Dalai Lama. And then, my inspiration led to organizing the first multi-person Nobel Peace Laureates Conference. This is the first. It was done in Virginia with 9 Nobel Peace Laureates. There were really 8 and 1 representative of Aung San Suu Kyi. Of course, she couldn't leave Burma. So this is His Holiness Archbishop Tutu, and the others were on both sides. And and I was keeping a very low profile over here, and the dean, who was on this side of the Dalai Lama, told me to come over and stand there, because after all, I had organized it. And I sort of think that he was telling me, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So in fact, I stopped this extreme devotion. Anyway, I forgot what I started to say. Oh yeah, I had those extremely deep experiences that I won't tell you about. And I stopped doing that meditation. And meditation, which led to extremely powerful experiences in dream time. Extremely. There's more, it's hard to call it dream time. And I went downstairs to the breakfast, and Geshe Wangyal had had fixed a totally defunct TV that was rattling on with some stupid show on. This TV had never worked, and he had this stupid show on, and he kept it on, and while it was on, he said, "You have to begin studying." You see, I had stopped that meditation. And he said, "You have to start studying." And from then until today, I have turned myself into an extreme meditator into an extreme scholar. Published 50 books, and am involved in an extreme project, translating, a large number of books from the syllabus of Gaomon College. It began that day. So, inspired my journey, 5 years, which at that time everybody felt was, people we knew felt was so extreme. Nobody had lived with him for 5 years. Since that time, there are others who have lived, like Joshua and Diana, who have lived with him, many more years than 5. But at that time, it was totally unknown for anyone to live with him for more than 5 years. But he wanted me to leave and become a doctor of medicine, which was totally impossible for me, because I had not even taken many of the high school math courses, trigonometry, calculus, and those sorts of things. Never mind college science courses. The only one I did was geology. So I went on to the University of Wisconsin to study and get a PhD degree in what is that? So anyway, that's my contribution to your movie about Geshe Wangyal. You can see how important he was to my life, which I'll add at the end, began even when I was crawling. I began meditating, even though I lost my memories that came back because of him. Thank you.